The last shot of war had barely echoed across the valley when the mist rolled down from the mountains, thick and sour with the smell of rain and rot. Lila Mae stood on the porch of her crumbling home, her hands swell of her stomach, road that wound down through the hollow. The war had taken everything, her brothers, her father, the harvest, and left her alone with whispers that grew louder each night. The old women in town said she should have never carried the child. Said no good ever came from that bloodline, that her mother had sealed their fate long before Lila was born. But the child had come anyway, silent and heavy, as if it belonged to something older than life itself. When the soldier appeared at dusk, limping from the shadows with the tattered grey of his uniform clinging to his bones, she knew he wasn't a stranger. His face was too familiar, his eyes too much like her own. He spoke her name as if he had known it since birth. The way he looked at her, she couldn't tell whether it was love, pity, or recognition. And when he said he'd come back to claim her, Lila didn't argue. Somewhere inside, she felt that he'd always been coming, that his return had been written in the blood she carried, in the child that twisted beneath her ribs, waiting for the end of the war that had already been lost long before it began. The valley, the people, even the air seemed to know what was coming. And as the night fell over the hollow, the crickets stopped singing, and the first cry of a mourning dove echoed like a warning through the trees. Lila Mae turned her gaze to the soldier and saw, for the first time, that he wasn't entirely human anymore. The valley was a place that had long ago been forgotten by maps and mercy alike. Tucked deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, it existed as if time had taken one look and decided to pass it by. Roads twisted into nothing, bridges collapsed into rivers that no longer had names, and the air itself seemed too thick with history to breathe easily. The people who lived there spoke in voices roughened by generations of silence, carrying the weight of old sins and older secrets. Outsiders rarely came, and when they did, they didn't stay. Something about the place pressed down on you, made you feel unwelcome, made you understand why the locals never looked a stranger in the eye for long. At the center of this forgotten valley stood the remnants of an estate once known as Briar Hollow, though even the name felt cursed when spoken aloud. The trees grew unnaturally close together there, their roots tangled in what the elders said were graves from a war no one remembered. The air carried a damp sweetness, like earth mixed with decay, and at dusk, a mist crept through the hollows, curling around fences and doorways as if searching for something left unfinished. It was said that the valley had its own pulse, that if you stood still long enough, you could feel it beating beneath your feet. When patient, like the heart of something that never truly died. The isolation had shaped the people as much as the land. Families had lived there for centuries, their bloodlines looping back on themselves until no one could tell where one name ended and another began. They bore the same grey eyes, the same crooked smiles, the same quiet dread of what ran through their veins. It was a place where people married for survival, not love, and where the past was something inherited, not remembered. The church had burned down twice and was never rebuilt, leaving behind only a steeple leaning like a broken finger toward the sky. Children grew up hearing the same warning whispered by every mother: don't wander past the river after dark, because that's where the forgotten ones still walk. The valley didn't just breed people, it bred stories. Tales of a woman seen in white among the trees, of strange cries in the fog, of a light that flickered deep in the woods when the moon was new. Some said it was superstition, others called it memory. But for those who lived there, it was all the same, because in that place, where generations never left and the land refused to let go, the line between the living and the dead had blurred long ago, and the hollow kept its own kind close. Lila Mae was born beneath a storm that rattled the valley like a warning. The midwife swore the lightning struck twice that night, once on the ridge, once in the field behind the house, and that the air itself seemed to hum when the child first cried. From the start, she carried the look of the hollow in her bones, a pale reflection of all who came before her. Her eyes were too light, her hair too white for her age, and her manner too quiet for a child. People said she was born remembering things she shouldn't, that she stared at the old portraits in the parlor as if she recognized them, whispering names no one had spoken aloud in decades. Her lineage was both her pride and her curse. The family name, once carved into courthouse stones and stitched into Sunday gowns, had become a whisper passed from mouth to mouth like something contagious. There was power in it once, before it rotted. Before too many cousins had married too many cousins, and too many children had been born with the same haunted faces. Her mother used to tell her bedtime stories about their ancestors who owned half the valley, who built their house by hand, and who swore to keep their bloodline pure. What she never said was what that purity had cost. The same names filled the family Bible, generation after generation, until it was less a record and more a confession. By the time Lila Mae could walk, she had already learned the weight of her own name. At school, the other children called her Ghost Bride and Cousin's Child. When she passed by, conversations dropped into silence. Her family was known for keeping to themselves, for speaking little and marrying less. It was said that the last man to leave the hollow and take a wife from the outside never came back, and that his bride's letters stopped arriving after the snow melted. Her mother, before her death, warned her never to bring shame to the family. "Our blood is our bond," she said, her voice sharp with fear rather than pride. Lila Mae carried that warning like scripture. She walked with a kind of reverence, as though the ground beneath her feet belonged to the bones of her kin. Sometimes, at night, she would dream of faces she had never met, faces that looked like hers, calling her deeper into the dark. The family line was her inheritance, but also her cage. Every door in that old house led to a reflection of herself, every whisper in the wind seemed to know her name, and every beat of her heart reminded her that there were some things you could never outgrow, not even if you tried to leave the hollow behind. The war ended the way most things did in the valley, quietly, without fanfare, as if the world beyond the mountains had finally forgotten it existed. The news reached Briar Hollow weeks late, carried by a tattered newspaper that smelled of smoke and sweat. But for Lila Mae, the end of the war brought no peace. Each night, she stood on the porch, staring at the road that wound like a scar through the woods, waiting for something she couldn't name. The house felt emptier since her mother's death, its silence heavier, its corners darker. The only sound that broke the stillness was the creak of the rocking chair her father had built before he went off to fight and never returned. When the soldier came, he didn't arrive like a stranger. He limped up that same dirt road just as the sun was sinking, his uniform hanging off him in shreds, the grey so faded it might as well have been ash. His face was half hidden beneath a beard, his eyes clouded but steady. He spoke her name before she could speak his, saying it in a voice that made her shiver because it sounded like it came from her own blood. He said he'd fought with her brothers, that her father had promised him Lila's hand before the war began. No one had ever told her about such a promise, yet something in the way he looked at her made her believe it had been real. He told her his name was Silas, though the way he said it made her wonder if that was truly his name or just one he had borrowed along the way. The townsfolk didn't remember him, and when Lila asked about his family, he said only that they were buried near the ridge. His presence unsettled the valley. Dogs barked through the night, chickens stopped laying, and the river took on a strange, bitter smell. Still, she couldn't send him away. There was a gravity to him, a pull that felt older than the war, older even than the family curse whispered through generations. Silas treated her with a strange tenderness, calling her wife even though no vows had been spoken. Sometimes, she would catch him standing outside at dawn, staring toward the hills where her brothers had disappeared, whispering words she couldn't hear. The neighbors warned her to be careful, to remember what happened the last time her family trusted a stranger. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that felt like recognition, like the echo of a story she had already lived before, one written in the blood that ran between them both, binding her to a promise she never made but somehow already kept. Lila Mae's pregnancy began as a secret she tried to hide even from herself. At first, it was only a faint sickness in the mornings, a heaviness she blamed on the damp air and the sorrow that clung to the house like mildew. But soon her reflection began to betray her, her face paled, her hands trembled, and the shadows under her eyes deepened into bruises. When she could no longer deny it, she told no one. There was no husband to claim the child, no father or brother left alive to protect her name, and no one in the valley who would believe it had happened cleanly. In a place where bloodlines were worshipped like scripture, her growing belly became an accusation. The old women who passed her gate stopped speaking when she appeared. Children pointed and whispered, and the preacher refused to look her in the eye. Rumors spread faster than wildfire, each one crueler than the last. Some said the child was born of sin, others whispered it was punishment for what her ancestors had done. A few, in hushed tones, claimed she had taken the soldier to her bed before he vanished into the hills. But those who knew the hollow best said something darker, that no man had touched her at all, that the child she carried was the valley's own, conceived by the curse itself, bound to the same blood that had never learned to run clean. Lila Mae tried to find comfort in the only relic her mother had left behind, the family Bible, its pages stained and frayed from generations of trembling hands. But when she opened it, she found names she didn't recognize, births recorded beside deaths that made no sense, and strange symbols drawn in the margins that looked more like warnings than blessings. Her mother had once said that every woman in their line bore a burden, a secret meant to die with them. As the months passed, Lila began to understand what that meant. She felt the child move long before she should have. Its heartbeat seemed to echo in the walls, and at night she dreamed of the old portraits watching her from the hallway, their painted eyes following her every step. When the midwife came to check on her, she left pale and shaking, muttering that the child's heartbeat didn't sound right, that it was too strong, too fast, too alive for something not yet born. Lila Mae stopped sleeping after that. She felt as though the house itself had turned against her, whispering in the creak of the floorboards and the rustle of the curtains. Each morning she woke with the sense that the child already knew more than she did, that it had come into her life not by chance, but by design, carrying the unfinished legacy of every sin her family had buried beneath the valley's soil. The people of the valley had long believed that the family of Briar Hollow carried a curse that no prayer could lift. It began, they said, with betrayal, an act so vile that even the soil seemed to turn against them. The story shifted with every telling, but the core never changed. One of Lila Mae's ancestors had turned on his kin during the war, trading blood for survival. Some claimed he had delivered his own brother to the enemy for a sack of gold, others whispered that he had done far worse, that he had broken the sacred vow of the family's bloodline, mixing it with that of outsiders, then killing the child that came from it. Whatever the truth, it was said that the valley never forgave him. From that day on, no child of Briar Hollow was born whole. Some were stillborn, some came into the world twisted, and others, like Lila Mae, were born too pale, too silent, their eyes reflecting something that didn't belong entirely to the living. The curse was not only in their bodies but in the land itself. Crops failed without reason, wells soured overnight, and the animals refused to graze near the old family graveyard. Every time thunder rolled over the ridge, people said it was the valley remembering, calling out for the blood that had been spilled in betrayal. Even the trees around the house grew differently, their trunks split in strange patterns, their roots digging deep as though trying to pull something back underground. No one went near them after dark. Lila Mae grew up hearing these stories whispered around kitchen tables and behind closed doors. Her mother told her they were only tales meant to scare children into obedience, but Lila could never fully believe that. Too many things in the hollow lined up with the old stories. When she was little, she would hear laughter coming from empty rooms. Once, she swore she saw her dead grandfather sitting on the porch at dawn, his face half hidden by shadow, staring toward the family cemetery. The next day, the river overflowed and washed away half the road leading into town. As her pregnancy deepened, so did the valley's unease. Storms came more often, and the air grew thick and metallic, like it carried the taste of blood. The neighbors began leaving food at her gate instead of knocking, afraid to cross the threshold. They said the child she carried would be the one to settle the debt the hollow had been paying for a century, that its birth would mark the final chapter of the curse. Lila Mae didn't know whether to believe them, but when she looked at her reflection, she sometimes thought she saw another face behind her own, watching from just beyond the glass, patient and knowing, as if waiting for the curse to claim its rightful heir. When Lila Mae and the soldier moved into the old house on the hill, it was as if the past itself had been waiting for them to return. The home had stood empty for years, its shutters hanging loose, the roof sagging, the porch swallowed by creeping vines. Yet the moment they crossed the threshold, the air seemed to shift, colder and heavier, thick with something that had been sleeping far too long. The house had a presence, one that made the hairs rise on the back of her neck, as though it was aware of her. Every floorboard groaned beneath her feet like a voice too old to form words, and the smell of damp wood and iron lingered in every room. At first, Lila Mae tried to make it a home. She swept the dust from the parlor, lit candles in the fireplace, and hung curtains to block the endless gray of the hollow. But no matter what she did, the house resisted her. Every morning, she found the windows open though she had locked them tight, and the clocks, all 5 of them, reset to midnight. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. Sometimes, she could swear their painted eyes followed her across the room. The soldier, Silas, told her it was her imagination, that the house only needed warmth and life to settle again. But she noticed how he avoided looking at the mirrors and how he refused to go upstairs after sunset. The nights grew longer, filled with sounds she couldn't explain. Whispers drifted down the hall, faint and trembling, as though carried on a draught that never stopped moving. Doors opened and closed on their own, and sometimes the faint echo of a baby's cry rose from beneath the floorboards. Lila Mae tried to tell herself it was the wind, but the sound followed her even when the air was still. The soldier began keeping a lantern burning at all hours, muttering that the dark felt too alive. When she asked what he meant, he only said the house remembered more than people did. One evening, she woke to find him standing before the old family portraits, his hand pressed against the cracked glass of one frame. It was her mother's image staring back, her painted smile faint and blurred, her eyes almost the same shade as Lila's. The soldier whispered her name like a prayer, and when Lila touched his shoulder, he flinched as if caught in a sin. From that night on, the house no longer felt like a shelter but a witness. Its walls held their breath, its silence deepened, and Lila began to sense that whatever had haunted her family for generations was not gone, it was only waiting, patient and unblinking, within the walls that bore their name. The discovery came on a night heavy with rain, when the wind howled through the cracks in the old house like a mourning voice. Lila Mae had been unable to sleep for days, haunted by the feeling that she was never truly alone, that something in the house had begun to breathe with her. She walked the halls in the flicker of a dying candle, following a faint sound, a rhythmic tapping behind the plaster near the stairwell. The noise was too deliberate to be the wind. When she pressed her hand against the wall, the tapping stopped, replaced by a single dull thud, like a heartbeat buried in wood. Something compelled her to tear it open. She fetched a rusted knife from the kitchen and began to scrape away at the softened plaster until her fingers bled from the dust and splinters. What she found was not what she expected. Behind the wall lay a wooden box, wrapped in the remnants of lace and cloth that had once been white. Inside was a leather-bound journal, warped by time, its pages yellowed and soft from the damp air. The name written inside the cover made her hands tremble. It was her mother's. She sat on the cold floor, candlelight trembling as she turned the pages, reading words that should have never been written. Her mother's handwriting was jagged, desperate, as if she had been writing to keep from losing her mind. The entries spoke of the family's pact, of blood that had to remain unbroken, and of a ritual meant to preserve their lineage. Each generation, it said, was chosen to bear a child whose conception was not meant to be questioned, for the valley demanded its own. The deeper she read, the more the lines blurred between faith and madness. Her mother wrote of voices that guided her in dreams, of a man who came to her when the moon was red, his face both familiar and strange. She wrote that the child born of that union would be the bridge between the living and the forgotten, that to deny the old ways would bring ruin upon them all. Lila Mae's breath caught as she reached the final pages, where her mother's words grew frantic, repeating a single line over and over. Asterisk, he is not your husband, and yet he will come for you too. Asterisk. The candle flickered low, and for a moment Lila thought she heard footsteps overhead, slow and measured, as if someone had been listening all along. She looked toward the staircase and saw that the portraits on the wall seemed to tilt ever so slightly toward her, their painted eyes gleaming with something like recognition. The journal slipped from her hands, and she realized that the truth her mother had hidden in the walls had never really been buried, it had only been waiting for her to open the door. The night of the birth arrived with a storm so violent that it seemed to tear the valley apart. The wind screamed through the trees, bending them until their branches scraped against the roof, and the thunder rolled with the sound of cannon fire echoing from the hills. Lila Mae knew the time had come long before the pain began. She had been feeling the child move differently for days, restless, almost aware, its rhythm syncing with the flicker of the lightning outside. The air inside the house was thick and sour, heavy with the smell of rain and smoke from the lanterns that burned low on every table. The midwife, a hard woman who had seen her share of tragedy, arrived pale and shaking, muttering prayers beneath her breath. From the moment she entered the room, she would not meet Lila's eyes. As the labor grew harder, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The walls seemed to pulse with the storm, expanding and contracting in time with Lila's cries. Every clock struck midnight at once, and the sound reverberated through the halls like a death toll. The midwife wiped her brow, whispering that something wasn't right, that the baby's heartbeat was too strong, too steady. She tried to leave once, saying she needed more water, but Silas locked the door before she could reach it. His face was pale in the candlelight, his eyes fixed on Lila as though he was witnessing something divine or terrible. When she begged him to open the door, he said only that the child had to be born here, in this house, under this storm, the way it was meant to be. The lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The rain stopped beating the windows, the wind held its breath, and even Lila's screams died in her throat. Then came the cry not from her, but from the baby. It was sharp and echoing, a sound that didn't belong to something newly born. The midwife dropped the bundle she was holding and stumbled backward, her eyes wide with horror. She whispered something about the child's eyes, about how no human child should look that way, and fled into the hallway. The door slammed behind her, and Lila heard her footsteps vanish down the stairs. Silas stood still, his gaze locked on the cradle as if he recognized what lay inside. When Lila tried to reach for her child, he stepped between them, murmuring that it was not yet time. Another flash of lightning revealed the reflection of the two of them in the mirror across the room, and behind Silas, the faint outline of her mother's face watching, her expression neither sorrowful nor kind. The storm roared again, and the light went out, leaving the house in darkness and the sound of the baby's cry rising above the thunder, steady and unnatural, as if announcing that the hollow had claimed what was owed. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the valley drowned in fog and silence. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and smoke from the lanterns that had burned through the night. The house stood still, its windows dark, the front door slightly ajar as though something had slipped out while the world slept. When the neighbors finally gathered the courage to approach, they found the midwife's carriage overturned on the road, its wheels sunk deep into the mud, but there was no sign of her. Inside the house, the floors were slick with rainwater and candle wax, the furniture overturned, and a strange mark burned into the floorboards beside the bed where Lila Mae had labored. The cradle was empty. No one saw Lila Mae again. The bed was cold, the sheets undisturbed, and yet the faint impression of a body remained as if she had only just risen. Silas, too, was gone. His coat hung on the hook by the door, his boots still caked in mud from the night before, but there was no trace of him beyond the porch. Some said they saw him wandering toward the river before sunrise, carrying something bundled in his arms. Others claimed they heard two sets of footsteps echoing through the mist, one heavy and uneven, the other small, dragging softly behind it. The search parties combed the woods for days, but all they found were footprints that began in the mud and ended abruptly in the middle of the clearing, as if the ground had swallowed them whole. In the weeks that followed, the valley grew quieter. The birds stopped nesting near the house, and the livestock refused to graze on the surrounding fields. The once clear stream behind the property turned murky and red after every rainfall. The townspeople whispered that the hollow had taken back what was its own, that the curse had come full circle. On stormy nights, travelers swore they could see a dim lantern light moving through the trees and hear a woman's voice calling out a name that no one could quite make out. Years passed, and the story turned into a warning. Children were told not to wander near Briar Hollow after dark, for that was where the inbred bride still walked, searching for the child she lost to the storm. Some claimed they had heard a lullaby carried on the wind, soft and trembling, followed by a second voice, a low, humming tone that didn't sound human. The house eventually collapsed into ruin, swallowed by vines and time, but even in its silence, the valley never forgot. Every time the thunder rolled, it echoed her name through the hills, as if she were still there, waiting in the fog for the war and the storm to end again. Decades later, the story of Lila Mae and the soldier had become little more than a local legend, a ghost tale passed down through generations. Few people dared to visit the remains of Briar Hollow, and those who did never stayed long. The land seemed to reject intrusion, compasses spun aimlessly, footsteps echoed where there should have been silence, and the air grew colder the deeper one ventured. It wasn't until a historian from out of state came searching for the truth that the legend began to unravel into something far darker than superstition. He arrived under the guise of studying forgotten settlements, but the real reason for his visit lay in the old letters he'd found in a courthouse archive, letters signed with Lila Mae's family name and dated years after she was said to have vanished. The historian spent weeks combing through the valley, interviewing the few elders who still remembered the hollow before it fell silent. Most refused to speak, their eyes darting toward the hills as if afraid of being overheard. One finally told him that Lila Mae's bloodline had been buried deeper than anyone knew, that she had not disappeared but had been hidden, sealed away with her secret. Intrigued and uneasy, he followed their directions to the ruins of the house. The earth had nearly swallowed it, ivy twisting through its windows, the roof collapsed into the parlor. He stepped carefully over the debris, the floor soft beneath his boots, and descended into what remained of the cellar. There, beneath the cracked stone and rotted beams, he found a space untouched by time. At the center of the cellar was a shallow pit, covered by planks so old they crumbled at his touch. Beneath them lay what was left of a woman's body, her bones curled as if in sleep. In her arms rested a small bundle of decayed cloth, and when he brushed it aside, the light from his lantern caught the glint of something pale and smooth, a cradle carved from human bone. The historian froze, his breath catching as he realized what he had uncovered. Beside the woman's remains lay a journal, still sealed shut with twine, the initials LM faintly visible on the cover. He didn't open it right away. The air around him seemed to shift, heavy and humming, and he felt the distinct sense that he was not alone. From somewhere deep within the hollow, a sound rose, soft at first, like the echo of a lullaby, then louder, layered with a second voice, deep and rhythmic, as though the valley itself was breathing again after years of silence. The historian fled before dawn, but he never spoke of what he read in that journal, only that some histories were buried for a reason, and not all stories of the forgotten are meant to be remembered.